With a little luck, a low-budget cash-in can become an icon. But when a studio has no money for its films, can pure imagination be enough to succeed? Debuting in 1965, Gamera was created to be, in all honesty, a Godzilla ripoff, a means for Daiei films to cash in on the popularity of Toho's creation and the sudden wave of popular kaiju films created in its wake. With the first film's nuclear bomb origins and a plot centered around civilians, reporters, and the military trying to understand and stop the rampaging beast, the influence of Gojira in both type of monster and type of story was obvious to everyone who watched. But by the time Gamera the Giant Monster was released, Gojira was already about to star in his 6th movie, having moved far away from the original horror allegories created by Ishiro Honda and embracing the wild sci-fi family-friendly style that defined most of the Showa era. Daiei had to scramble to keep up. Gamera has only really evolved across 2 distinct periods, Showa and Heisei, with large gaps between them due to the collapse of his home studio. But it was the Showa era that formed what everyone came to love about our giant flying turtle, stretching from 1965 through 1980 and encompassing 8 Gamera films. This is a giant monster designed to latch onto a growing craze, slowly becoming his own unique beast, only to be laid low by the failing studio that gave him life in the first place. Here we'll explore the entirety of Showa Gamera, from the creature's atomic age origins that cashed in on the Gojira craze in a completely obvious copy, to its belated glorified clip show that said goodbye to the kid-friendly kaiju, and the many moments of low-budget brilliance in between. And in this journey through a struggling studio's attempts at monster glory, and the small band of creators that worked with little money or hope for success, we'll see how a fan-favorite kaiju became beloved by generations. From 1954 through 1965, Godzilla ruled Japan's theaters as the mostly undisputed king of the monsters, as, aside from a few one-off monster movies, Godzilla was the only kaiju with an ongoing film series. Despite the brief break after Godzilla Raids Again, 1962 through 1965's 4 Godzilla movies proved that audiences were hungry for kaiju chaos. Enter Daiei Films. Daiei was founded in 1942 as part of the Japanese government's efforts to reorganize and strengthen their film industry during World War II, and shortly after the end of the war, Daiei found success with a series of hits, including Rashomon, Ugetsu, and Gate of Hell, with the 50s being its most successful period. In 1962, Daiei found its first taste of long-running success with the release of the Chanbara film The Tale of Zatoichi, with the blind swordsman going on to star in many more films to come. But that same year also saw the debut of King Kong vs. Gojira, proving to the world, and Daiei in particular, that kaiju films had lots of potential. And so the studio decided to gamble on their first entry into the booming subgenre. Enter, giant horde beast Netzura. Daiei's first attempt at a kaiju film was set to be about a giant swarm of rats, but Japan's health department shut the production down because dozens of rats used on set were escaping and becoming a threat to public health. This type of insane, silly disaster is what we call foreshadowing. In its stead, Daiei created a new kaiju, Gamera. The idea came from Daiei studio head Masaichi Nagata, who apparently was struck by the idea of a flying tortoise during a flight, with Nagata instructing his staff to come up with ideas for the studio's inevitable kaiju film. It was then screenwriter Niisi Takahashi who came up with the pitch, initially titled A Lowly Tortoise Flies Through the Sky, and then a fire-eating turtle attacks Japan. Very literal. Eventually, our soon-to-be star kaiju was named Kamera, based on kame, the Japanese word for turtle, and eventually modified to be Gamera, to avoid similarities to the word camera. Noriaki Yuasa, who was hired to direct Netzura, was chosen to direct Gamera with special effects by Yonesabaru Tsukiji, also grandfathered in by Netzura. The two, alongside art director Akira Inoue and independent consultant Masao Yagi, created the design for Gamera. The resulting film was no easy task, with a limited budget, short production schedule, and a lack of faith from Daiei's higher-ups, who saw Yuasa as not up to the task. and that Gamera would not be able to compete with Gojira. Really, the entire Showa era history of Gamera is the story of a studio's ambitions constantly colliding with its mistakes and limitations, creating a series of films that are both inventive and cheap. And this is apparent from the very first film. Gamera the Giant Monster is the only Gamera film in black and white, and made well after color films had been adopted by most of Japan's film industry, including the Godzilla movies. Gamera was filmed in black and white because Daiei was hurting for money and had already spent so much on the cancelled Netsura. In total, the original Gamera cost around 40 million yen. For comparison, Invasion of Astro Monster, released that same year, had a budget of 132 million yen, and that was seen as a cutback for Toho. Still, the team soldiered on, and Gamera starts with some Cold War commentary, as American fighter jets shoot down an unidentified enemy bomber over the Arctic, which causes a nuclear bomb to explode, cracking open the polar ice and unleashing Gamera. So right away you have a setup that obviously echoes Gojira, and Ishiro Honda's use of the atomic bomb as the genesis for his kaiju. But after a few minutes, the Cold War allegories end. Gamera isn't really the nuclear metaphor that Gojira was, but much like Honda's original kaiju film, the movie has our protagonist using one method after another to kill Gamera. Guns, bombs, freeze bombs. I love that flipping Gamera on his back is a viable strategy because he's a turtle, and eventually trapping him in a rocket and blasting him to Mars. Gamera is also front-loaded with American characters and the English language, which were included to hopefully appeal to US audiences without the need for heavy re-editing. But of course, it's Gamera who's the real star here. Much more standardly reptilian than Goji, but with several unique qualities. Fire breath, being impervious to normal weapons, sucking up energy, flying like a dang UFO, and jamming radio frequencies. And while Gamera is mostly a destructive force, there's an interesting layer that shows the monster to not be fully evil or constantly destructive, with Gamera catching the young Toshio, who believes the monster is a grown-up version of his pet turtle he released, and saving his life. Toshio adds a little wrinkle that the Gojira franchise would only take advantage of later. Like Wu-Tang, Gamera is for the children. Of course, Toshio is kind of an idiot, mistaking the little turtle he had set free as having turned into Gamera, and chasing the kaiju around Japan. Gamera sequels would later make him into a canonical protector of children, but here, it's just this little jabroni thinking that a rampaging monster is his bud. Toshio, don't jump onto the exploding train. It's not gonna work out for you. But despite its cash grab nature and some real leaps in logic, Gamera is a lot of fun and has some great style to it. With its small budget, not everything looks great, but there are some killer effects. Gamera's fire breath and ability to suck in flames is really cool. Being a practical effect, I think it's much more visceral than the rotoscoping used for Gojira's atomic breath. And of course, the spinning jet-propelled flight really sets Gamera apart, using wires and flames with miniatures and creating an image that would forever define the creature. Ultimately, Gamera ends with some positive commentary on global cooperation, as it's the collaboration of Japan with both the US and the Soviet Union that defeats the monster. But without any real-world parallels in the title kaiju, it's mostly just a nice note to end on. Even Gamera is given a hopefully happy fate, with maybe Mars being a place where he can exist in peace. Or, you know, maybe he'll just asphyxiate. What do I know? I'm not a rocket scientist. I'm a bear. I suck the heads off fish. Gamera the Giant Monster would go on to be released in Japanese theaters on November 27th, 1965, as part of a double feature with New Kurama Tengu, The Battle of Gojo Hill. To supplement the film's profits, Daiei sold the US rights to World Entertainment Corp. And Harris Associates Inc., who retitled it Gamera the Invincible. I did not misspell that, they gave our turtle boy an extra M. With the dubbed and heavily re-edited version released in America at the end of 1966. Gamera was not as well received as Gojira, but the film was still a surprise hit in Japan, giving Daiei the go-ahead for a kaiju franchise of their own, immediately rolling into a sequel. 1967's giant monster duel, Gamera vs. Baragon, is the only film of the Showa era not directed by Yuasa, with Shigeo Tanaka instead taking over, and Yuasa made special effects director. Vs. Baragon would, however, be written by the returning Nii-san Takahashi, and Takahashi would be the sole credited screenwriter for every Showa Gamera movie. The reason that Yuasa was demoted was that Daiei had saw him as a lower-tier director who they had nearly taken off the original film. But since the original was a success, Daiei deemed its sequel as an A-list production, complete with a now 80 million yen budget that would create lavish spectacle. And it's this sequel that would set a precedent for the rest of the series. Vs. Baragon is the first Gamera movie filmed in color. It uses footage from the last film to pad out its runtime. And like the trajectory of Godzilla's movies, it introduces a new villainous kaiju to turn the rampaging Gamera into the hero. With Gamera's rocket to Mars hit by a meteor, the giant turtle is freed from his one-way trip and comes spinning back to Earth. But despite him being featured heavily at the start, this is actually kinda barely a Gamera movie, with the star kaiju only showing up in the intro, a very brief battle with Baragon at the midpoint, and the final conflict. Gamera vs. Baragon is a lot like Ebirah Horror of the Deep, released the previous year, focusing on a small group that goes to a tropical island for treasure, and the star kaiju is nowhere to be found for a really long time. Good thing I like this kind of shit. As a whole, Vs. Baragon is skirting the line between serious and fun that the franchise would fully cross afterward. There's a lot of human drama, added to be in line with Daiei's opinion that this was now a big-time movie. But it also has lots of wild and fun elements par for the course of any Showa Kaiju movie. Baragon is a massive threat, but he's also a lizard that shoots a rainbow from his back. It's just that the results are horrifying devastation. Also, it's hilarious that Baragon's only weakness is water. This kaiju shoots a freezing ray. Bro, ice is water. That's like if cows were allergic to milk. Overall, you can see the doubled budget in the film's effects and scope. Still, the seams show. Gamera flying is a cool effect, but it loses a little something when physically interacting with another object. Besides that, this thing looks great. I love the rich color. Once again, Vs. Baragon would bring in the yen that Daiei was hoping for, and like the original, it was released in the US, but this time as a straight-to-television premiere, shortened, dubbed, and retitled War of the Monsters. Gamera was here to stay. 1967's giant monster dogfight, Gamera vs. Gauss, has Noriaki Yuasa back in the director's chair, and is the solidification of what a Gamera movie really is. Here's all the elements that would carry over to the rest of the Showa era. The giant turtle is much more heroic, coming to save the day from the volcanically awoken Gauss. Gamera is then beaten in battle once and retreats underwater to heal. And throughout it all, the kaiju has some sort of special bond with a child he protects. This time it's Aichi, who he saves from Gauss. This decision takes that thread from the original movie of a kid having a connection to Gamera and makes it more than the delusions of a really dumb boy. Vs. Gauss is also the solidification of the overall tone of Showa Gamera. Big monster battles, wild effects, high stakes. But there's a willingness to be silly and fun, with these serious about not being serious. Gauss is also very stiff and fake. Of course, alongside its emphasis on a lighter tone, there is some very silly stuff, like a car getting cut in half by Gauss's beam and still driving, its occupants unharmed. Also crucial is that our little boy's ideas are what help defeat Gauss, with his worldview antithetical to the greed of the adults across the movie. I think that's actually some very smart social commentary while being fun and childlike. In the end, the views of a child are aligned with the morality of the movie, and it's childlike logic that will define the rest of Showa Gamera. Another massive differentiation for these films is that despite the Gamera movies being clearly made for a young audience, they're much more willing to have their kaiju bleed. Sure, it's mostly purple and pink and blue, but there's lots of spurts. I love kaiju movies because they're these massive, over-the-top metaphorical depictions of our relationship with the planet and society, where urban anxiety smashes together with the most over-the-top natural disasters. Humongous monsters straight from ancient cultures and crystallizing modern fears topple buildings and do battle with little regard for humanity. There's something pure about what these movies are trying to say. Even when the cheap miniatures, flimsy sets, and flying wires are obvious, it's easy to get swept away by their imagination. And of course, Vs. Gauss is the first time Gamera would get his own theme song. Here it's Gamera Song, composed by Akira Komachi, with lyrics by Hidemasa Nagata, and performed by the Hibari Children's Choir. This is not the main theme that would come later, but I think it's kind of a banger. Next would come Gamera vs. Space Monster Virus, and the start of the series' full-on obsession with outer space enemies. Aliens approaching Earth set on taking the planet for themselves are attacked by Gamera, defending the planet. Meanwhile, a couple Boy Scouts take a mini-submarine for a joyride and race the kaiju underwater, firmly establishing that of these two leads, an agreement between Daiei and American International TV mandated that one be an American boy, with Daiei hiring Carl Craig, the son of a US soldier stationed in Japan, despite having no acting training. Really, it was American International that kept Gamera and, in relation, Daiei afloat thanks to their deal. Whatever AIP wanted, Daiei was likely to grant to keep the deal in place. Unfortunately, this is the moment when Gamera starts to suffer from major budget issues, as Daiei had suddenly run out of money, slashing the budget down to 20 million yen. You know things are dire when we start having a goddamn 10-minute clip show in an hour 20 movie. And once Gamera is placed under mind control by the Virus aliens, his Tokyo rampage is reused footage from the original. You can tell because the black and white footage is tinted blue. And like before, it's childlike logic that dictates Virus's plot. Gamera's one weakness is his unusual and overpowering kindness to children. The aliens are Japanese men in medical frocks, who turn out to be wibbly-wobbly octopus aliens in disguise. There's a telepathic wall that gives our abducted kids juice and sandwiches. Glowy eyes are the spookiest thing around, and the entire Earth decides to surrender to protect the children. These Gamera humans are simply built different than Goji humanity, and the aliens are defeated by letting the two boys run around on the ship and mess with their stuff. And there's the Gamera March. Composed by Kenijiro Hirose, with lyrics by Hidemasa Nagata and performed by the Daiei Children's Chorus. The march is synonymous with Gamera, and is silly, literal, and an absolute blast. So, in the end, Vs. Virus doesn't really give audiences an interesting story, and you don't really get many interesting new alien designs. And also, the kids aren't very good. But the climactic kaiju fight has some very silly charms, as they can't even afford to hide any of the seams of the suits with lighting. Gamera gets speared in the belly over and over. Again, surprisingly violent for a kids film. But it's this strange transgression of the norms set by competitor Gojira, who rarely bled, that made the kaiju feel unique and even thrilling. Really, Gamera is like the John Moxley of kaiju. This guy's gonna gig, whether or not you think it's appropriate for the match. Anyway. That leads us to Gamera vs. Giant Evil Beast Giron. Once again, AIP requested this star one Japanese and one American kid, and for the film to focus on space travel to cash in on the space race happening at the time. Here, the kids find an alien spaceship and accidentally blast themselves to a counter-Earth, with Gamera following to protect them. Still, with only a budget of 24 million yen, all those space scenes and wild alien worlds are pushing what little money Yuasa and company had to its limit. You can see that in how another Gauss suddenly shows up, using an old suit spray-painted silver because there was no money for another monster. And Gauss is chopped up into pieces by our new knife-head villain, Giron, named so after the guillotine in a public naming contest. Actually, the scene of Giron killing, cutting up, and trying to eat Gauss scared children so much that it was removed for a while, because this was a little extreme, even for a Gamera movie. Lots of strange choices abound in Vs. Giron. There's really bad rear projection, using what must be the world's oldest projector and most beat-up screen. The aliens are these Ginyu Force-looking MFs, and eventually we find out that the aliens want to eat humanity, with them knocking the kids out, shaving one's head, and almost eating his brain. The climactic fight here continues the trend of each movie's finale operating on a more and more cartoonish level, complete with giant shurikens, lots of blood, and Gamera flipping around on a monkey bar. Still, there's a lot of great energy and inventiveness here. Like I said, this is child logic. When anything is possible, why shouldn't a giant turtle bring a couple of lost boys home from Counter-Earth on a ship held in his mouth? To back up the series' ongoing support of kaiju kid power, its B-plot revolves around a girl on Earth trying to convince the adults that the boys were taken away in a spaceship, with the parents eventually admitting, Also, it's super obvious that Giron inspired the knife-head kaiju from Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim, taking a silly but cool monster concept and turning it deadlier. Pacific Rim pays homage to a lot of different kaiju and mecha influences, but Gamera is a clearly big ingredient in that stew. Like most of the Showa films, vs. Giron ends with a strange but hopeful non sequitur lesson from the kids.
博士、地球に生まれた僕たちは、よその星なんかに憧れずに、この地球を平和にして、戦争も交通事故もない世界にしていくしかないんだって。
For the first time in several films, 1970's Gamera vs. Giant Devil Beast Jigger saw an increase in budget, with the film costing 30 million yen. Still, it opens with a montage of past film highlights to expand its runtime. Really, the entire reason for vs. Jigger having the plot it does is because of the debut of the Japan World Exposition Osaka 1970, also known as Expo 70, the World's Fair that ran throughout the year, with a story that sees the ancient beast Jigger awoken from Wester Island. Do you get it? After a mysterious statue is discovered and taken, most of the film takes place at the real-life expo, giving Daiei sets they didn't need to build, saving them money and giving the expo extra exposure around the world, just so long as no building replicas were destroyed in the film, which is why Gamera is so determined to protect it. Vs. Jigger introduces one last element: humanity misunderstanding the heroic acts of the Starcadian and attacking him, putting our now heroic monster in danger from the people he's trying to protect. While this specific dynamic only happens this one time in the Showa era, it becomes crucial to Shusuke Kaneko's Heisei era films. As always, vs. Jigger isn't afraid to get violent, even when it's expressly made for younger audiences. Gamera stomps Jigger's ass in an early fight, until the villain pulls out a special needle attack that basically crucifies my dude. Later, multiple ships full of people explode, and we see them die. And while these films boil down to the same basic structures, you can feel Yuasa and Takahashi trying to keep things fresh. There's a lot of inventive ways of Gamera both being temporarily defeated and also finally killing his enemies. Each new enemy feels like the studio asked a kid to draw an animal from memory and went from there. And these fights come down to much more than just shooting some atomic breath at the right time. No offense, Goji, you know you're still my main man. The big swing here is that our main kids enter a frozen Gamera through his mouth to kill the Jigger larva inside of him. Again, it's about the adults regaining a childlike perspective, even if Gamera spikes Jigger in the head with the statue and murders this dude, to the happy cheers of the kids watching, and then disposes of the body. You're so cool, Gamera, even if you don't work Thursday through Saturday. Remember, everybody gets one. Despite Jigger being a hit, Daiei was financially failing and entering its final years. The lack of fiscal liquidity on the studio's part caused the next entry to be continually delayed, and have its budget set at 35 million yen, which is equal to about $97,000. But that wasn't all. Daiei's financial troubles meant that Yuasa was no longer a contracted member of the studio, and instead was a freelance hire. Once again, with no budget and no money for sets and extras, the creators needed a pre-existing location, which led them to Kamogawa SeaWorld. And 1971's Gamera vs. Zigra is the silliest Gamera yet. The film takes place in the future, near the end of the 20th century, where man has mastered space travel, and Japan has a moon base, soon destroyed by an alien spaceship, and voiceover stating that cue misidentified sea life, dental hygiene lessons, alien abductions, mind control, and a growing space fish kaiju that's decided to wipe out polluting mankind and claim our oceans for its own. It's an anti-pollution film, but really, we're all here to see Gamera play his theme song on Zigra's back with a rock. A true sign of dominance. With basically no budget, vs. Zigra is obviously made without the money to build much more than its new monster. The pre-existing SeaWorld location, while giving them the setting needed to film, is boring. And unfortunately, that lack of budget is so restricting that the signature childlike imagination that has propelled the series up to this point is basically non-existent. There's a bit of perverse fascination to watching this and wondering how they'll manage to make this movie with no money, but that's about it. With that, we enter the final days of Daiei, which are an embarrassing disaster. The 60s in general were a tough time for Japanese studios, with movie audiences shrinking and about half of Japan's theaters closing during the decade due to competition from TV. And while Toho and Godzilla struggled, they rebounded while Daiei fell. To stave off their financial problems, Daiei merged with fellow struggling entertainment company Nikkatsu to form Dainichi Eihai. But in August 1971, Nikkatsu withdrew from their partnership, leaving Daiei to file for bankruptcy in December of that year, reorganizing in the aftermath but losing its distribution wing in the process. Not only that, but the Zatoichi series moved to Toho, causing Daiei to lose their rights to both the films they had already made, as well as future entries in the lucrative series. But wait, it gets worse. Apparently, studio staff rioted on Daiei's property when they found out they were losing their jobs due to the bankruptcy, with the riot being so bad that it destroyed most existing Gamera props in a fire. The films were finished. There was no money to make anymore, and there weren't even existing props and costumes to reuse, in the hopes of a micro-budget sequel. After releasing a new film annually for 7 years, Daiei's Gamera run was at an end. But there would be one last gasp for the fire-breathing turtle 9 years later. Daiei would eventually reform as a subsidiary of Tokuma Shoten, and with its debts mostly gone and a tiny group of employees, Daiei brought back Yuasa for one more film, Gamera Super Monster in 1980. And Gamera Super Monster is also an embarrassing disaster. What is there you can really say about the plot of Super Monster that isn't just... turn it off? With an opening narration that's just still images being panned across, we get an egregious Star Wars ripoff, and then some superhero flying effects that will make you wish you were watching Superman 4. Why? Well, both Star Wars and Superman had been super popular at this point in time, with both Superman 2 and Empire Strikes Back released the same year. It makes sense to hop on the bandwagon. Kaiju movies are known for following non-kaiju movie trends, but putting footage of Super Monster next to either of these movies is horrifying. Super Monster's story sees a group of 3 secret superheroes become friends with a songwriting little boy, whose pet turtle eventually turns into Gamera to fight an alien force intent on invading Earth. And by fights, I mean that a Star Destroyer clone sits in outer space, shoots lasers, and unleashes every kaiju that Gamera fought in his past movies. It's an excuse to reuse all the old footage from previous movies in a series of fights that Super Monster doesn't even pretend to be new. And you know, for a movie that relies on old footage for its kaiju, it makes no sense why it takes an entire act for Gamera to show up. When he does, it's terrible green screen, and there's a lot of shots that are just really low res. While random bits of voiceover are used to try and hold the narrative together, and the film even uses footage from the anime's Space Battleship Yamato and Galaxy Express 999, it's bewildering. At the end, Gamera blows himself up to destroy the aliens. Off screen, of course. Do not watch this movie. It's a shame that Super Monster ends the franchise on such a terrible note, and one that barely gives its star kaiju anything new because, despite so many setbacks, Gamera is a really fun monster hero. The mix of on-land, underwater, and in-flight action makes this giant turtle very adaptable to any story and a variety of enemies. Across the Showa era, Gamera was brought to life with 4 different suits, each providing small tweaks to the initial design created by Masao Yagi, which weighed 60 kilograms, or more than 130 pounds. Initially, that suit was worn by multiple people who were strong enough to support the weight. Afterward, Baragon was portrayed by Teruo Aragaki in the next 3 movies. With each subsequent appearance, Gamera would be made to look friendlier, rounder, and less spiky, becoming more in line with the kid-focused stories, with multiple different suit actors bringing him to life. And for Gamera Super Monster, another suit, Uchugame, was made, but never used. Instead, the production opted for close-ups of a flying prop. It's a bad movie. Mythologically, there isn't much to Gamera in the Showa era, with his origins tied to Atlantis in the first film, and his connection to children propelling him throughout the following movies. But most of this is just spoken, as some sort of motivation to tie the fight scenes together. Gamera's arc from rampaging monster to friendly hero is the same as Showa Gojira, just compressed into a much shorter span of time and with little moral ambiguity. The simple morality and kid-friendly approach combines with all that multicolored blood to make something like a fairy tale that hasn't had its edges sanded down to not offend anyone. With the utter failure of Gamera Super Monster and the inability of Daiei to make any more films under their own power, Gamera was finished. Outside of the series, longtime shepherd Noriaki Yuasa would never make another feature film, eventually passing away in 2004 at the age of 70. Yuasa's legacy with Gamera is complicated. On one hand, he's the man that helped bring Gamera to life, directing all but one of the Showa era films. On the other, it's clear that Yuasa has limitations to his talent, not really being in the same league as Goji contemporaries Ishiro Honda or Jun Fukuda. Years later, when Kaneko brought the kaiju back to much greater acclaim thanks to his film's emphasis on human drama and social commentary, Yuasa would dismissively say, "They're just Gamera movies. They're not art films." I think Yuasa is a little unfair to his own films. They may not reach the heights of Godzilla, but they're inventive, fun, and, in the end, made millions of fans. In the long absence of Gamera, the turtle monster's international reputation was largely built on American International's shoddy re-edits and dubs, blending together with the already cheap and wild aesthetic of Daiei's work to create something infamous. In particular, it was Mystery Science Theater 3000's series of parody commentaries that introduced a lot of people to Gamera in the first place, making these films sillier and more infamous in retrospect than they probably deserved.
Gamera is really neat. Gamera is filled with meat. We all love you, Gamera.
Still, the legacy of Showa Gamera is one of constantly failing ambition that nonetheless managed to entertain, with its childlike wonder and a sense of shoddy creativity that felt like coming up with your own kaiju stories in the backyard. Despite their visible limitations, so many of these movies are fun, light, unpredictable time capsules of a small group of creators trying their best to succeed in a rapidly changing film industry, and within a studio that was constantly playing second fiddle to the titan in the field. And you probably know the routine by now. This is a retrospective, so it's time for a ranking of every Showa Gamera movie. At 8, Gamera Super Monster. I'm pretty sure ranking this any higher than dead last is an actual crime, given that it's basically a glorified clip show surrounded by some very bad additional footage. This is barely even a movie, and given that it doesn't even try to hide that these are old clips, I can't even give them some sort of passing grade for effort. It's bad. This movie literally and figuratively killed Gamera. At 7, Gamera vs. Zigra. With basically literally no budget, vs. Zigra is so obviously made without the money to build sets, or much more than its new monster, and the pre-existing SeaWorld location while giving them the setting needed to film is boring. And unfortunately, that lack of budget is so restricting that the signature childlike imagination is basically non-existent. There's a bit of perverse fascination to watching this, but that's about it. At 6, Gamera vs. Virus. Absolutely dire, but still charming in its low-budget efforts to entertain. The practically non-existent budget is evident in nearly every scene, with obvious reused footage from previous movies. Come on, I know that's the first film you just tinted blue. And the basic inability to build sets, the biggest indicators of Daiei's failing finances. Still, there's enough make-believe energy here for it to be fun in spite of its total lack of quality. Having the aliens hide in the bodies of humans who get their heads knocked off would be kinda dark if this wasn't the silliest shit you've ever seen. At 5, Gamera vs. Jigger. This is Daiei's last real shot at making a big budget Gamera, but its bigger budget is counterbalanced by kinda poor pacing and a lot of repetition. However, I'm constantly impressed by the imagination and creativity in most of these films, which fully embrace their message of childlike worldviews and how their plots and effects are constructed. Like going inside Gamera to fight a parasite, the total insanity taken at face value is what makes Showa Gamera so unique and fun. At 4, Gamera the Giant Monster. The original Gamera is a good time, and the most traditional man vs. monster kaiju film in the franchise. Obviously, Gamera was created as a Godzilla ripoff, and it shows in the basis and structure of this movie. But Gamera the Giant Monster is just really fun for kaiju fans. It's silly, makes way too many leaps in logic, and Toshio is a little dumbass. But Gamera is already a star after one movie. And while the film starts with some Cold War commentary, it almost immediately abandons it for the sake of kaiju fun and lots of set pieces. It's a giant fire-breathing turtle that flies. Just go with it. At 3, Gamera vs. Baragon. Pretty silly, but in the exact same way as Ibira Horror of the Deep, which I really dig. While I wasn't expecting Gamera to only be in about 10 minutes of the movie, and for Baragon to actually be the star, I enjoyed the human drama and all the fights to stop this weirdo kaiju. Like tropical settings, ancient monsters, and greedy humans that eventually get their comeuppance, that's a good combination for a kaiju movie. Also, Baragon has ice breath and a rainbow beam. Hell yeah. Good final fight too. At 2, Gamera vs. Giron. With a little extra money, the imagination runs wild here, colliding big ambitions with some very shoddy effects for something absolutely charming. As the main villain, Giron is just the right amount of ridiculous. Love the big knife head. This is Gamera being just a real good dude going the extra mile for some dumb kids who launched themselves to some sort of counter-Earth. And I love him for it. Name another kaiju doing it like this. And at number 1, Gamera vs. Gauss. I had such a great time with this one. Gamera vs. Gauss is unabashedly childlike in its logic, which it contrasts against the selfish greed of its adult characters. Add in a surprising amount of blood in its monster fights, and some truly inventive kaiju special effects that butt up against the obvious limitations of its budget, and you have the absolute blast that is Gamera vs. Gauss. It's obvious why Gauss would become the most famous Gamera foe. Having a flying villain creating mid-air dogfights immediately sets your kaiju apart, and gives you lots of possibilities. Anyone looking for a classic Showa monster picture should check this out. After a strange but ambitious run of films that flamed out and then fully shut the lid on its own coffin, Gamera would be presumed gone forever, alongside the collapse of Daiei. But although Gamera would go out in a blaze of, well, I guess kinda glory, the guardian of the universe was not gone forever. And 15 years later, Gamera would return under the guidance of Shusuke Kaneko for some of the greatest kaiju films ever made. Thanks for watching today's video, and a return to Kaiju Retrospectives. That's right, we're on to Gamera. After covering all of Godzilla, I knew that I eventually wanted to get to Gamera. And while it's been a little while since I wrapped up my Godzilla retrospectives, this was always going to be coming. In the past, I had watched all of Shusuke Kaneko's Heisei Gamera movies, and I think they are absolutely incredible. Some of the best kaiju movies ever made. But I hadn't watched the Showa Gamera movies before. So over several months, I did the Showa era research for this video, and honestly, these are so silly and so bad at times, but also so great. It's kind of a delirious blend of those low-budget effects and a ton of heart. And I think that's what made Showa Era Gamera endearing to so many people at the time, and in the decades since. Personally, I don't think that most of Showa Gamera holds up to Showa Gojira, but I still enjoy them a ton. And they laid the groundwork for the movies to come, so I can't fault them entirely. And the behind-the-scenes stories and the up and down finances of Daiei are so interesting to me, because it's just so obvious in each of these movies. All in all, Showa Gamera is a good time. And if you're a fan of Showa-era kaiju movies, you really do owe it to yourself to check out a few of these. At least watch Gamera vs. Gauss. It's a great time. So of course this means that the Heisei-era Gamera retrospective will be coming soon. And I'm really looking forward to talking about those fantastic films. And the Gamera research has also sparked my interest in covering Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim, and the follow-up Pacific Rim Uprising. To be honest, I wasn't a fan of Pacific Rim when I saw it in theaters all those years ago, but in the time since I've watched a lot of kaiju movies, so I'm sure my perspective on it has changed. So one day I will revisit it and almost definitely make a video about it. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite Gamera movies are, what you think about the Showa era, what you think about Pacific Rim, how you would compare Gamera to Gojira, and what other kaiju movies you'd like featured on the channel. Because obviously, big monsters and my channel are synonymous. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive Patreon-only reviews. Every month on Patreon, I do a monthly wrap-up of everything I've been reading, watching, and playing, and also one monthly Patreon review that is voted on by patrons. Last month was Akira, and this month is The Rocketeer. So if you'd like to listen to those, sign up for Patreon. Until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and remember, if you release a tiny pet turtle into the ocean, and a few days later a giant turtle kaiju shows up, it's probably just a coincidence. He's not your friend. Do not approach the giant turtle.